Well, here we are again with another DADCAW. The very end of the week, the final bit of time that I could get this out and still call this a weekly series, even though we're actually still behind by 1 week. I actually thought that earlier this week I would record one like Monday or something, get it out of the way, and then be caught up by the end of this week. But the time just flies away from us. Time just keeps on trucking. In fact, I can't believe that we're already almost completely halfway through the year. That is crazy to me. But we have been able to keep up with the daily mod streams, which is very exciting. And honestly, I'm quite satisfied with how much work we've been able to put out. Of course, the projections at the beginning of the year were in some capacity much higher, much highfalutin, a little bit more than I potentially can actually chew off, a little bit more than I can actually present and produce by the end of the year. But the idea was that I'd potentially have in consummate finished, the remake, of course, as well as maybe one of the Hydra campaigns or one campaign worth of Hydra content. Didn't actually think we would be spending so much time working with the melee aspect of Hydra. That was quite the revelation going into the midsection of our time in this year so far. And of course, a lot of other unexpected things happened soon after the year began. So, in the interest of still making the best of an admittedly bizarre and probably bad situation globally, we are chugging on. We are chugging on. We are keeping going, chucking that chicken, hanging out with our wings out. What do we got for you today? What do I have as a topic of substance? I actually wanted to talk a little bit about paralysis by analysis, because this is a topic that came up in maybe 2 or 3 Big Boys tables ago, as of the recording date of this particular podcast, DADCAW, whatever you want to call it. Caw it. Oh, actually, I should probably give the date. So it's 10:39 p.m., or obviously 2 minutes in, so it was 10:37 p.m. when I started this recording on the 20th of June, 2020, Saturday, just after fraud night, just after making some last-minute adjustments to the balance and to the game state of the Hydra new game state. So, been pretty exciting there. Just implemented the Wyvern. So, what am I talking about when it comes to paralysis by analysis? Lately, I've been pulling the trigger on a lot more than initially expected. I was much more conservative, actually, with some of the things that I would do, and maybe this is a good thing in some respects and a bad thing in others. I imagine it's not like a net positive or a net negative in any capacity. Pretty much any way you slice it, you can find some argument for being more conservative with changes to a game state or something like that when it comes to balancing and stuff. And you can also find an argument for just throwing stuff out and seeing what sticks out of what you throw at the wall and, cutting the rest loose. I think that you need some sort of nuanced aspect to it, but I was much more conservative before. And now I'm still very, very conservative in that respect. Still not 100% sure that everything that I'm planning on attempting is going to, sell me on the concept at the end of the day once it's executed. But I do think that an enduring prospect of the whole paralysis by analysis thing, an enduring aspect that continues to annoy people, myself included, anybody who's in any sort of creative discipline or looking to be a developer of any capacity, always comes back to this sort of concept in, be it deliberately like they're consciously thinking about it, or it's just something that plagues them, but they don't know how to put it to words. And that something, that idea, is the fact that you're dealing with this very pernicious element of the design process where you want to avoid feature creep. You want to avoid having too many different things on your plate and trying to do too many different things at once. And maybe you're looking at a bug list that you've been collating and it's getting bigger and bigger with every day. You're finding new things that need to be fixed, and you're trying to put out fires while also implementing new things that are in turn causing more fires for you to put out and more bugs for you to fix. That's basically been Hydra's game state and Hydra's development cycle over the last month or so since we joined GitHub with it. So it hasn't been a full month yet, but going on it at this point. And that's one of the things that I've taken away is it's actually not all that bad, even though I'm making it sound quite terrible, making it sound like I'm in over my head. I'm just, I've basically accepted that there's the invisible progress bar, and you're not going to be able to really see how much progress you're making towards completing that invisible progress bar. But you are always making progress, even though it feels like things are setbacks. Setbacks were always going to happen. In my opinion, setbacks are basically inevitable. The setbacks that happen are basically inevitable. It doesn't mean that same setback or that same kind of setback can happen in the future, because the whole point of having a setback is not only to fix what overcome that setback, but also to keep watch for how that setback might reappear, what kind of similarities you might end up, encountering in the future. And so if a bug happens because of bad code and I figure out what kind of code caused the bug and then fix that bug, I have to find the solution to that exact case in order to fix it. But in doing so, I can also actualize that knowledge by, weaponizing that knowledge in general by making sure that that same kind of bug doesn't happen. That same flaw in the process, that same flaw in the code doesn't happen. So to me, it's a necessary part of the development cycle of anything, is feeling like, wow, there's a lot of stuff that's setting me back, but then acknowledging that that's mostly an emotional response, a stress-based response, and not really a logical one, because like I said, unless you caught this error beforehand, in which case it never really would have shown up as an error because you would have fixed it before it really became a problem. Unless that was the case, you are more or less looking at something that you're always going to be considering, how shall we say, like a setback in that sense. And you're always going to be looking at something and saying, oh, wow, this came out of nowhere, left field, and really set me back in that respect. But it was always going to happen. So it's not really a setback because you were always going to have to overcome it. And that's one of the things that I think has helped me deal with this whole ever-growing list of things to do, chores basically related to the code and to the bug fixing and the whatnots, the who's'em whatsits, the schmanger bangers. So what do I actually have for you anyway? Segueing back into the core concept of this whole DADCAW, the idea that you're trying to avoid paralysis by analysis. It's that inevitability that actually brings me a lot of comfort and confidence, because I'm able to say, this concept inevitably will or will not work with my current skills, my current understanding of what my execution, what the execution is going to be like and what I'm really looking for. So if I've got a concept for a unit and that unit can fire on the move when you upgrade it, and it has an ability to target ground and attack a ground tile instead of, attacking an actual unit, and obviously it has a AoE damage so that it still deals damage when it attacks that way. And this unit is an air unit, and this unit moves slower when it's firing on the move, and otherwise needs to operate normally, but moves faster. And it's an expensive unit, requires a science facility. And, as obviously I'm talking about the Wyvern in this particular case, in case you couldn't tell. But the idea is, if I have this unit, I don't know if it's going to be good for the game. I don't know if it's going to be well-balanced, if it's going to be something that needs to be, nerfed or buffed, or if it even is something that I should touch until we get more understanding of how the unit actually works in current compositions. Maybe it needs to be rebalanced in terms of its cost or its tech tree placement or something like that. I don't know any of that stuff, even though I could very easily get paralyzed by the analysis of any of that stuff potentially being the case. I can't truly know until I actually try it. And inevitably, it will or will not check off all of those boxes, right? There's going to be some things where maybe it's too cheap or too expensive. It's going to check off one or the other. Potentially, it's very unlikely anyway that it's going to be perfectly balanced. But if it is perfectly balanced in that capacity where it's the perfect amount of money, perfect amount of resource cost or time cost or tech placement in terms of where in the tech tree it gets unlocked, if that's the case, then it would inevitably be like that too. And so that's one of those cases where you really kneecap the concept of paralysis by analysis, the entire phenomenon, the thing that can happen there. You completely avoid it entirely just by pulling the trigger and implementing the unit and testing it out and seeing what happens. That's what we did with the Wyvern. That's what we've been doing with a lot of the balance decisions. And that's what we're going to be doing with multi-building select when that mechanic shows up. And of course, it will result in a lot of changes to the actual core engagement of the game. Some of them may be positive, some of them may be negative, but it was always going to be like that. It's not something I can necessarily plan for because I don't really know, right? Maybe think of it like you've heard the concept of Schrodinger's cat, where either the cat is dead or alive, but it's actually in a superposition of both. Well, either a unit is well balanced or not, and it's in a superposition of both until you actually implement it and open the Schrodinger's box and find out whether or not it was good or bad. You don't know until you observe it. In this case, you actually want to observe it, because then you can say, unlike you can't revive the cat if it dies, but in this particular example, it's much more epic because you can fix the thing if it's unbalanced, or you can learn from it. Ideally you're going to learn from it anyway, but you'll learn from the failure and success and all that stuff, and you'll be able to use that to improve your design decisions in the future, and to also figure out if maybe the concept was half-baked and you pulled the trigger too fast. That's something else you can learn by pulling the trigger in the first place. Notice how I'm not necessarily absolving the more liberal usage of just going ahead and not necessarily analyzing. I'm not saying you shouldn't analyze at all. I'm not saying you shouldn't start to think about the knock-on effects that could happen. But if it gets to the point where you're too worried, too caught up in that idea, and you have what you feel like could be a solid unit concept or mechanic, and you just don't know exactly if it's going to fit in, just try it. Just put it in. See what happens. See what kind of experience you end up having as a result. Get a lot of samples, do a lot of unit testing, do a lot of general testing, see what ends up happening. Because that will tell you a lot more than being paralyzed by analysis. Paralysis by analysis can obviously extend to a lot more than just implementing a new unit or somehow affecting the game balance with a new mechanic or some other balance change. It can be related to creating anything, and maybe you don't feel like you're at the current skill level required to produce a full campaign or a specific kind of scenario or even a map crap submission. But if you don't do it, if you don't attempt it anyway, you won't really learn whether or not that you are capable of it. And perhaps you'll always assume that you weren't because you never did it. Perhaps that's the only reasonable thing to assume in that kind of world, but don't make that your world. Make the world a world where you actually did the work and tried it. See if you could do it. And you might surprise yourself. And if you end up not being able to or not feeling very happy with the end result, you can learn something from that. And eventually, with enough of that learning, enough of that practice, enough of that failure, you'll be able to grow and improve and become good enough to make something that you feel is a success. I'll put it to you this way. When I released in Consummate, I thought I had hit the pinnacle of StarCraft campaign design. Boy, was I fucking wrong. Didn't age well at all. But at the time, I thought that was great. I thought it was an excellent campaign. I thought it was the best campaign. Now, that claim might still hold true because Hydra is not really officially released, and like the 1.0 version was pretty much just a tech demo anyway. I don't even consider it a campaign as much. But regardless of what you might think about that, if it's certainly probably in the top 10, and that's not anything other than an indictment of the quality of its competition. Really, it's not anything to say of it itself as a project. But that all being said, we consider the idea that something that I believe is as flawed as in Consummate, something as flawed as I believe in Consummate to be, still feels at the time to be so good, the best, to make me the best, as like I made the best thing, so I must be the best maker, right? All of those thoughts and all of that satisfaction follow from releasing a project. There's no reason why you yourself, as a developer who is just starting out, or maybe you've been at it for a while, but you're still not happy about your work, at the end of the day, if you end up releasing what you feel to be a well-polished, well-rounded campaign, there's nothing stopping you from getting that satisfaction. Just like there's nothing stopping you from learning from whatever might be lacking from it either. Just like I eventually learned with Consummate. I didn't have the benefit of basically another version of me making videos and analyzing campaigns and breaking things down and figuring out the good and the bad out of all of these projects. Nobody did that for Consummate. You had some people play it, but their feedback was very superficial, usually balance-based, without having the chops as a StarCraft player to really say anything about whether or not it was hard or easy or whatever, and certainly didn't have the game design chops that I do by comparison. But these are all learning opportunities. Even though I had to do all of the self-teaching in that respect, or most of the self-teaching, I'll say, it still resulted in eventually a much better system so that I could produce much better content than I did back then. And it's all incremental. That's where the invisible progress bar really comes back into play, because it's not just for projects. It's not just for sub tiny projects like adding a new unit or completing an AI script or a mission. It's for you yourself as a developer growing. I don't know where the progress bar will finish. Ideally, it won't stop ticking until I'm dead, I guess, because I would like to continue to improve my entire life. I think that would be epic. That being said, I don't know where it ends. I don't know where it goes. I don't know what I'll be doing in 10, 20, 50 years' time. Hopefully the same stuff, in addition to some new stuff, like maybe having some kids or something. But, that's all in the future. For now, we can focus on actually incrementing that invisible progress bar in a positive way. And I think when you understand that concepts as they are on paper are inevitably going to be as good or as bad as they will be when you implement them. And of course, they're inherently tied to your execution. Hopefully that helps you deal with the paralysis by analysis thing. And I think an exercise you can do, generally speaking, is if you find yourself to be consistently suffering from paralysis by analysis, you can take something that you've been considering lately, but haven't pulled the trigger on it, and just pull the trigger on it. And after, honestly assess it. Say, where were the faults? What could I have done better before trying to execute on this concept? To flesh this concept out, to make it better, so that I had a much smaller margin of error when executing on it. What could I have improved there? And then basically just repeat that cycle of trying to flesh out a concept to meet your current standards of what a concept should be. And if you think you're around there and haven't been able to get it, if you're stuck on a concept and you haven't been able to improve it in any capacity, either pull the trigger on it. Well, basically pull the trigger on it one way or another. Do it or don't do it, and move on to something else if you're not going to do it. I think there's a lot to be said for that approach. It's basically the same thing as map crap, right? I mean, you really have a small amount of time to execute on a concept, and you have to figure out what your concept is even going to be. You get a theme, and then you got to figure out, how am I going to apply this theme into an RTS context, a macro-focused RTS project. Uses this theme. Map must involve a crash or a wreck, or map must insult the Chinese government. What the fuck do I do with that? I mean, okay, I guess I can do some like characters or something. Like, it really gets you thinking in the headspace, I think. Gets the gears turning. And oftentimes the concepts are not great because the concepts are inevitably rushed in that respect. So you can learn a lot, I think, just in that microcosm, but you can also apply that to a general project and a general project's development process. So I hope this DADCAW has been thought-provoking and potentially helpful to people who were suffering from this. This was a long overdue one, and I apologize for the air conditioner in the background. It is quite hot. I think it was like 93 degrees or something today, so pretty insane. But I think it was an important talk to have, and I'm glad that I recorded the video. So at the very least, it may be useful for me in the future. I hope it was also useful for you. Join us next week, where we'll probably have 2 DADCAWs, because I really got to catch up. It's supposed to be a weekly fucking series. I mean, come on. And of course, stay tuned for more Hydra mod streams, Hydra game nights, and potentially some other stuff. I don't know. We'll see. Bye.